Joining me here on the Executive Exchange on Moneyweb TV is Saad, the CEO of Aspen Pharmacare. I've been looking forward to this conversation, Stephen. There are so many things that I really want to get to the bottom of with you. And I want to start with your journey as Aspen Pharmacare and delve into your mindset when you have built a global company anchored in South Africa. Can you reflect on that journey for a moment for us?
Yes, it has been. It's been a long time. I'm trying to go back. It's been a long, long time. It's been nearly 30 odd years, and it started with. I can't tell you that's where my mindset started at Global. In fact, it started with a much narrower focus than that, and we never ever wanted to have a factory. Because I've been in factories before, and we ended up getting the biggest factories in the Southern Hemisphere and some very large ones now in the Northern Hemisphere as well. Didn't want to leave South Africa commercially, do a few products, work from a small house in Greyville. And of course, what followed was South African druggists. We built a big domestic base. We moved to Australia with some size, and then before I knew it, we were probably, and still are probably, South Africa's most global company in terms of operations in different countries around the globe. So much along the way, I don't know. I think, let me start with that, Bronwyn. But I think if I say one thing, what keeps you going on a journey for this long, it's not about money. It becomes, and to keep the energy. And I mean, that's the one positive thing I must say is if you run out of energy, then you best you go and you do something else. But I think if I have to just pin it down to one thing, I think it's to have a purposeful operation, something which gives you purpose to wake up every day, and to be in that situation. I think at a personal level and certainly an organizational level, to contribute positively to society, to neighbors, particularly those most in need, makes it worth getting up every single day.
Stephen, just before we move off,
you don't want to wake up anytime they, oh no, this is it. But it's not all. It's very easy to put 30 years and say, okay, this is where we started, this is where we are. But along the way, it's not a straight line.
And it's those punctuation points that I really want to jump into now. One of the questions that people often ask is, how do you deal with a perceived credibility gap when you're competing in international markets in the developed world, coming from South Africa?
Yeah, it is. It's more than perceptions. I remember, let me go back through something. I remember when we started in Australia, and they said, well, what are you starting from scratch? In South Africa, you go and do safaris, we play you rugby. We're not going to buy your medicines. Why would we buy medicines from Africa? And that was literal comments. And so you have to work out how you get around that and how you manage it. And I mean, we did, and so there's a different strategy for everything. For Australia, what we did was we said there were many people who had to retire in the industry who were 62 and 60 and still wanted to work. And they had lots of credibility with the doctor base. And so we employed those older people. And we got scripts and more scripts, and then many multinationals. Gee, look at you! You're number one in terms of generating scripts. How do we partner you? And then from that base, we built from literally a zero base, and as you could see, it was worth the 2.4 billion Australian dollars at the end of that. In other markets, we partnered with multinationals, often acquiring their brand, and so often by association with the brand, you also have credibility. So products that doctors recognize, everything from Diprivan, which is an anesthetic, to Viagra, which is not an anesthetic, going all the way, having all those type of brands in your portfolio also give you credibility. And then, of course, you can start with credibility, but at the end of the day, your team behind it have got to retain or sustain their credibility. Those are two sort of examples I would think that I could give you on that. But not easy. Opening, no one's saying we're desperate to get medicines from Africa. They might want to come here for safari, but I don't think they associate you with supplying them medicines.
Another challenge that all listed company CEOs have to navigate is, of course, long-term thinking in a short-term world. And how do you manage that clarity of long-term when you've got that consistent pressure from analysts, from shareholders? They want quarterly results.
Yeah, it's not always a pleasant experience. I've done it for maybe over 100 quarters. But when you think about pressure is often associated with negativity. There are positives with pressure. It forces focus, and being under public scrutiny makes you also maybe think sometimes of what people are saying. And you listen, and you've got to listen carefully to all of it. It's not, I'm talking now personally, and I'm saying, well, why did we list? Why are we listed? We haven't asked a shareholder for any cash, and to go through all of that, why be in a listed scenario? But we are where we are. I think that critical to managing that pressure is always you've got to just, you can hear a lot of noise, and of course it's impactful. But I think you've got to be careful. There's two types of noises, and both of them can give you pressure: positive noises and negative noises. And I think from a positive noise pressure, you've got to be really cautious that you don't believe everything people say about you. It's a bit like sport. One day you're the best rugby player, the next day you miss a kick, a goal, and you're not so good anymore. And it's the same with negative pressure. And I think what we take as confidence out of that pressure and building pressure is having a strategy and a plan. It's when you don't have a plan and someone throws stuff, you end up rudderless. So it's very important to have a strategy plan. It doesn't have to be cast in stone, but you have a set plan on what you're going to do, because then you can live with a certain superiority over that pressure, knowing that you have a plan that would relieve the pressure or not relieve the pressure, but at least you know where you stand. It's a tricky environment, and what we try and do at Aspen is not let short-term pressures influence long-term strategy and goals. So, for example, when we went into sterols and sterile manufacturing, we knew it was a 5 to 10 year project. Now, you wouldn't do that if you're not that I'm an unprofessional CEO. Let's just say a professional CEO says, this is what I do in my first 100 days. The last thing is you tell people, 5 to 10 year window here. I've been very fortunate in being a sort of a shareholder in the business and saying, I know this is the right strategy for this business in time to come, and will give us new levers.
You talk about short-term pressures, and of course you have to navigate them on an ongoing basis. They could be regulatory, they could be economic. Look at the furore we're dealing with in the global environment at the moment. But you are sometimes going to have to make decisions in the short term, and I'm sure you've made many over the course of your time at Aspen. Again, tough balancing act. Is there any secret to being effective in making unpopular choices in the short term?
Yeah, so you want to have so it depends what pressures there are, or what's changed in the environment. I think you've got to assess that. Then you assess that against your strategy and plan and say, is this something that's impactful in the short term, medium term, or is this a sustained problem? I'm trying to think of examples over the past. So, for example, I'll give you an example. In Venezuela, we had a fantastic business, and one day the army were all over our warehouses and taking stock out of our warehouse, and the government refused to pay us. Okay, so you say to them, oh, is this a short-term problem, and we can come back here in 6 months and fix it, or do we pack our bags? We pack your bags and go. We were in, and that was something that came overnight from a great business that we had. And you've got to actually say, well, I might have had a strategy here, but events have overtaken me. Then we have, let me think of another example. We have a business in Japan, and then on a day, Japan say to this pharmaceutical, we don't care what product you've got, whether it's got a high gross margin, low gross margin, but we are going to decrease your products every year. We're going to decrease your products pricing. The 1 year it was 8%. Now you say, God, price 8% is all to profit. At best we grow this business 16 or 15% in turnover just to get back to where we were in profit. You know what? It's probably better off having your money in the bank. So you decide that market might not be for us.
That's great insight, Stephen. Let's talk a bit about being a very global, as you said, the most global South African company, and the importance of culture and values and managing that culture for Aspen Pharmacare across multiple geographies, across multiple time zones. I mean, that in itself is such an enormous project. Have you got it right?
Yeah, it is an enormous project, and I can't tell you that it's not. I'm not going to tell you, and I'm not going to. It is an enormous project. Before you, as you wake up, the sun's coming up over Asia and Australia, and as it's going down in our business, heading off towards Mexico and somewhere, and everything in between, you've got to manage. And there's something going on somewhere across our group, and when you're doing, hundreds of millions of rands daily and all of that, there's something going on. So it isn't easy, and particularly, if you go to a textbook and say how do you start a global business from zero scratch, they might tell you look at multinationals, and it took 50 years and 60 years and whatever our process it took. We did it relatively quickly, or very quickly, and I would think that if I had to say one piece of advice, if that's what you're looking for in here, I would say that we did something different in that we still have a very federated model. I could never go and visit every factory or even every country that we're in. I wouldn't have time to go and do all of that. So all we can do is bring the right leadership in place, and people who got the same values, and we tell them what our values are, and you see how they perform, and we say, go and own this business. And so, for example, in Australia, Trevor was with us from day one, and, he speaks about his business, and he created a brilliant business. And we try and have that across the globe, and we've got it. It's very hard. I tell you, the hard part is you do get let down. I mean, understand that there will be people that you trust who do terrible things and disappointing things. And we had that a few times across Latin America. And I remember the board telling me, you have to get out, just get out. And I would say, yes, give me a chance to look, not because it was material to the business, but I was worried about the opportunity loss of not being in Latin America, because I thought our model fits it there. Must have gone through 3 or 4 CEOs in Brazil, and eventually they all report. I had all the functions reporting to me. I never told the board that, because I said, what are you doing running a small business like Brazil? But when we got it right, and we did get it right, and the trick here is that you always immediately, when you're in a tough spot, you want to pull the handbrake up, bring central control, and then you break your model. So you have to keep trusting, and it's not easy. At some stage you want to pull the handbrake, but eventually we find the right people with the right value systems. And our Latin America is our largest region, probably, and one of our largest and probably one of the most profitable regions within Aspen. But that was from a dreadful start. So it's not always easy to get values and culture, but certainly being federated was the single reason why, and trusting people, why we were able to spread as quickly as we can. Because you can say somebody in Australia, we trust you, you can manage Asia. You manage in Brazil, you can manage Mexico and Colombia. And so that's a critical way to build culture and I believe to roll out a business.
At the beginning of our conversation, you said it doesn't go in a straight line, right? You look back at what you've created and it's a very, very impressive story. But there are those situation along the way. And I suppose the question is, what setbacks within Aspen Pharmacare have taught you about your own leadership style?
I think if I can just talk about setbacks in just generally, you never want to have setbacks. No one chooses to say, I'm desperate for a setback, so you don't want to have a setback. But if I look back over time, all the most important lessons I learned much more from a setback than from moving forward seamlessly on an area. And sort of molds your character, molds the organization's character. And when I say molds it, it's having to get up from that setback and fixing what you did here. So what have I learned about, I try and look very carefully within the business as to why you have a setback. What was the setback? It's quite hard if you have the same setback twice from the same teams, because there's a couple of things that can mean it. It could mean that they're not too bright, or it also means they don't care. Either way, there's not a great answer there. So in terms of leadership style, I encourage people to make mistakes, not to make mistakes, but encourage people to try and to test boundaries. Otherwise, you're never going to go beyond average. And in doing that, I think one will invariably make mistakes. But it's not making the same. You can make more than one mistake. Try not to make the same mistake twice. But from a leadership style, it's quite tricky sometimes, because if the setback is a massive setback for a group, you've got to understand there's people who've got incentives on the group, and they're sitting and they've outperformed in Latin America or Europe, and one factory performance brings the whole group down. So it's not easy managing people in that setback. And so you've got to make sure you have a very strong team. People are not going to start pointing fingers at each other in a tight spot. I think it's no different to any team sport. And I just see myself as a coordinator of the team, but it's not always easy. Not always easy, because sometimes I remember my late grandmother always said to me, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown." And every setback, even though I wasn't involved in the setback, in the group, is something that you take responsibility for. But I do take responsibility, and if there are issues, I believe it's my responsibility to take responsibility for the setback, albeit I'll go back into the structures and we'll argue like hell about what happened and why it happened. I think if you are to leadership, then you need to be responsible for all consequences of it, good or bad.
Do you believe, Stephen, that you are a tough boss?
I think that, how do you talk about yourself in these things? I have very high expectations of people, but I think I've got the EQ to understand where their limitations are. So I can't set a benchmark for everyone in every position. We're all good at something completely. We've got commonality, but we're all good at different things. So I do expect you to give 100% of yourself, and that might be very different for somebody in a laboratory to somebody selling in the field, and your relative positions. I am a very approachable boss. I think that's, if you've got a problem, you can come in. My doors are literally always open, and people do come in and out. So I don't know. It's hard for me. I think you're gonna have to ask somebody else that question. But I do set high expectations of people, but I do ask them to always have balance, and I don't want anyone chained to a desk at Aspen.
I think you've given us great insights into the type of boss that you are, Stephen. Here's one more personal question before I get onto your advice to the next generation of leaders. And it's something that I've grappled with. So having spent 25 years on the front line as a news anchor, I found it very, very difficult to separate my personal identity from my news anchor identity. And I look at your role and CEO roles in a very similar vein. that question often manifests in my brain. How do you separate Stephen Saad, a personal man, from the CEO of 30 years plus?
Sure. Um, it's a very difficult question to answer for me, because I think that, it's sort of in my DNA, and it's very hard to split it. So I think the way you put it about yourself was something I can absolutely relate to. So you will go into a public place, and people will see you as Aspen. I mean, the one time I had a bit of latitude was, well, and still do, but it was a lot more initially, was when I was chairman of the Sharks Rugby. So that probably got a lot more interest from third parties, and they literally put chairs up in a table while having dinner with all my daughters and talk about Sharks Rugby. At least with Aspen, they'll go to me, buy, sell, what must I do? And they walk past. But on a personal level, it's very hard for me, because so much of what I do in Aspen, have done within Aspen, is all about what helps define me, and that DNA in me is a DNA in Aspen. And so I battle. So I don't know if I've answered your question really badly or answered it at all, but yeah, I find that one a bit of a hard one.
As I said, it's the same conundrum that I face and have faced throughout my career. It's not there's no easy answer, I don't think. Especially when you're passionate about what you do. It is.
Exactly. Yeah, it is.
What leadership habits do you think most matter over time? And this is now we're moving into that advice to the younger generation of leaders coming.
Leadership. I think that having a very clear, and I'm talking about leadership or strategy or plan, just leadership. I think you have to be just leadership. I think you have to be consistent. You have to articulate where you're going, what your plans are. You have to listen really, really carefully. I always say to my leadership team, they'll say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. So you listen twice as much as before you talk. No one wants to see what we in Durban call a boogamina as a leader. In listening carefully, it doesn't mean you have to accept everything that people say, but you need to assess it. You're not going to be successful if you do what everybody else says and believes, because there are barriers. If the society sets barriers and only a few people can get through that barrier, and you need a certain leadership style and a certain value system to get through them. And I think those are important for a leader. So you can't quit. You should, but don't be stubborn. You need to change course. You can't quit. So perseverance is absolutely key. That you will have curves in the road and turns of the road is a given. You need to have a plan. You need to sit there and have a plan, and you test it, and you need people to buy into that plan and moderate your plan for what you see. And I think what else? I think if you're thinking about any business, but particularly if you want to go outside of your country and outside of your comfort areas, it takes a huge amount of courage. And if you're going to, it's an easy word to say, it's a very hard quality to live. And I think probably the most important thing with leadership is getting the balance right between passion and logic. And it's a bit, it's a bit like, and I love that quote was in Khalil Gibran in The Prophet, when he talks about a sailing ship, and it's so, you've got to get the wind in your sails, so that's when the passion's hard. But if you keep pushing with that passion too hard, you can't just run on passion. Yes, you can, I want to win this rugby game, but you haven't been in the gym, you last about 2 minutes, and then you burn out. At the same token, if all you do is rely on logic, you're going to be caught in the barrier. So to get that, sometimes you have to run through a brick wall, but you can't run through a brick wall every day. And if you're absolutely logical about everything you're doing, then the odds are dead against you being a great leader, running a great business. So you can't afford to be absolutely logical. So it's how you get it right. So when the wind's up, you use the sail, and otherwise you keep a firm hand on the rudder. So you look at the sail with a firm hand on the rudder and work out where you're going. That I think would be my leadership advice. It's more emotional than telling you, I think you should keep your expenses down. You should focus on detail. I think those are not leadership characteristics, but I think there might be characteristics. Don't go and buy a flashy car on your first day because you made money on day one. Those would be business advice rather than leadership advice, if I got your question right in terms of distinction.
And I love the emotional advice that you're weighing in there. Let's talk about, and this is a question, Stephen, I've interviewed you many times over the years that I've been in this space. And I've never asked you this question, but perhaps other people have. What advice would you give yourself, your 25-year-old self? Looking back now, knowing what you know, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Sure. What would I say to myself then? I think if I knew everything I knew then, that I know now, that I might not have started the journey. I would have said that looks too flipping hard. So I also, I'm also cautious because you sort of you got to say, hey, this is the advice I'm going to give you to miss setbacks, or to not have a curve in the road. And that's quite cool. Except, if I just think about my kids, you don't want them to get sick, okay? So you mollycoddle them and you put them in it, and you put them, and don't expose them to the environments. They don't get colds, flu. If you protect it like that, and then suddenly you expose, then suddenly the kid has pneumonia, okay? So what I'm actually saying is that the setbacks and the necessary cycle in life in order to manage what comes later on. So if you're asking me for advice on what, to a 25-year-old son, and say to him, I'm going to stick to daughters at this stage, I've got 4 of those. If I sat with my daughters, I never try and protect them from that, because I've learned so much from that. So that's not what you're here for. I don't believe that you go in there to avoid setbacks. Of course, you don't want to have setbacks, but you need to learn from each of those experiences. I would say that try and put yourself in a position, and I go right back to where I started, where you feel you have a purpose every day. Of course, money matters and financial matters, but to transcend that, it's important to have something where you feel you're doing something meaningful in a community. And that's the big positive also in South Africa. You can make at Africa, you can make meaningful changes. So I often feel blessed to be here because you can do something meaningful and change people's lives. So I would be saying that if you can find that and find happiness, and happiness, I believe, is found in balances. I've always said that, I think in the past we might have had a discussion. Not easy always to find balance in leadership situations, but all our balance is different. Some people like to play the piano, some people want to run marathons. But I think if you can find that balance in your life, then you become a leader that understands and can empathize with people and understand that you need balance. Whatever you require in your life, and you have a balanced organization, trying to balance people within it. And you go for it. Just go for it. Put your head down. One life, put your head down, have a full go. But, be smart about having a full go. As I said to you earlier, sometimes let the sail, sometimes the rudder, sometimes both. But you have a full go, and try not listen to too much negative comments. Listen and understand if there's value in it. But, I've sat with results, and you used to turn the TV on and someone would say, oh, look at that guy, he's been drinking the Kool-Aid or whatever it was. He said, really? Just sold the business for 26 billion rand from zero, and that's what you've got to say? And I think, well, what do I care what he says? What do I care? Am I comfortable with myself on it? Was it? That's cool. And you move on.
Stephen, we've had, as I said a minute ago, lots of conversations over the years. Thank you for navigating this one with me. I think it's been one of the more personal conversations, and your advice and wisdom is going to be very well received on the other side. So again, thank you very much, Stephen Saad, the CEO of Aspen Pharmacare, joining me here on the Executive Exchange on Moneyweb TV.